The leather-clad biker sneered down at the man in the wheelchair, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at this guy, taking up space where real men sit." His companions erupted in cruel laughter, their mockery echoing through the quiet diner like shattered glass. The man in the wheelchair, thin, pale, with hands that trembled slightly as they rested on the armrests, said nothing. He simply stared ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something distant that only he could see. In that moment, surrounded by cruelty and ignorance, he carried a dignity that no amount of leather or bravado could touch. What those bikers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand as they hurled their insults, was that the silent man before them had once commanded the skies, had made split-second decisions at speeds that would liquefy their bravado, and had sacrificed more for strangers than they would ever know. They were about to learn a lesson in respect that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a small-town diner just outside Colorado Springs, the kind of place where truckers, locals, and travelers intersected over coffee and pie. Captain James Mitchell had wheeled himself to a corner booth, grateful for a quiet moment away from the VA hospital where he'd spent the last 8 months learning to navigate a world that had fundamentally changed. The smell of coffee and grilled onions usually brought him comfort, a reminder of simpler times before the mission over hostile territory, before the surface-to-air missile, before everything went dark and he woke up unable to feel his legs. He'd ordered a burger and was waiting patiently when the motorcycle gang rolled in, 7 men in their 40s and 50s, all leather vests and patches, boots that thundered against the linoleum floor. They commanded space the way men do when they've never been told no, spreading out across multiple tables, their voices loud and aggressive, as they joked about their ride through the mountains. James barely noticed them at first. He was used to fading into the background now, to being overlooked or worse, stared at with pity, but he couldn't ignore them when their conversation turned toward him. "Hey, check it out," one of them said, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and a bandana tied around his head. "Wheelchairs taking up a whole booth. Probably on government handouts, too." Another one chimed in, younger, with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. "Yeah, maybe he should eat at home if he can't manage a real restaurant. Some of us actually work for a living." The words hit James like physical blows. He'd faced enemy fire, had pulled his burning aircraft across miles of hostile desert, had watched friends die and had nearly died himself, all for people like these. People who didn't know him, who would never know what he'd sacrificed. His hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles went white. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy who'd worked at the diner for 30 years, stepped forward. "That's enough. This young man is a customer just like you, and I won't have you talking to anyone like that in my establishment." The bearded biker laughed. "Your establishment? Last I checked, lady, this is a public place. We're just making conversation." "Then make better conversation," Dorothy said firmly, setting James's burger down in front of him with a gentle touch on his shoulder. She'd seen the Air Force pin on his jacket. She knew. But the bikers weren't done. They continued their commentary, just loud enough for James to hear every word. Jokes about useless eaters, about people who couldn't contribute to society, about how back in the day, people like him would have been left to fend for themselves. Each comment was designed to dehumanize, to diminish, to hurt. James felt something breaking inside him. Not anger exactly, though that was there too. It was something deeper, a profound exhaustion with cruelty, with the casual violence that people inflicted on each other, without thought or consequence. He'd fought for these people. He'd given everything for their freedom to sit in this diner and mock him. He was about to leave, to wheel himself out and eat his cold burger in the parking lot, when the door chimed. The first person through was a woman in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back, wearing a leather jacket, but not the costume kind the bikers wore. This was functional, worn from actual use. Behind her came another person, then another, then another. They kept coming, filing through the door in a steady stream, men and women of various ages, all carrying themselves with a particular kind of bearing, a quiet confidence that filled the room like a change in air pressure. Within 60 seconds, 35 people in leather jackets stood in the diner, forming a semicircle that naturally, almost accidentally, positioned themselves between James and the bikers. They didn't say anything at first. They just stood there, their presence transforming the entire atmosphere of the space. The bearded biker's face had gone from ruddy confidence to pale uncertainty. "What the hell is this?" The blonde woman stepped forward. She was perhaps 5'6", lean but clearly strong, with eyes that had seen things most people only imagined in nightmares. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried. "That man you've been mocking? His name is Captain James Mitchell. He flew F-16s, 3 tours, 47 successful missions. On his 48th mission, he provided air support for a convoy that was pinned down by insurgents. He stayed on station even after taking enemy fire, even after his instruments told him to eject, because there were 18 soldiers on the ground who would have died without him. He saved all 18 lives. He lost the use of his legs, saving Americans he'd never met and never will meet." The diner had gone completely silent except for her voice. She continued, "We're members of the 3/8th Fighter Wing out of Hill Air Force Base. We were passing through on our way to a memorial service for one of our own. Captain Mitchell here?" She gestured toward James, whose eyes had filled with tears. "He trained half of us. He was an instructor before he deployed. He taught us not just how to fly, but why we fly. He taught us that the mission isn't about the aircraft or the adrenaline. It's about the people on the ground counting on you." One by one, the people in leather jackets began removing them. Underneath, they wore flight suits or military t-shirts. One man had a prosthetic arm. Another woman had burn scars visible on her neck. These weren't weekend warriors or costume enthusiasts. These were warriors. The real kind, the kind who'd signed blank checks to their country payable, up to and including their lives. A younger pilot, couldn't have been more than 28, stepped forward. "Captain Mitchell was my instructor. He's the reason I'm alive. He's the reason I know how to think clearly when everything's going to hell. He's the reason I came home to my daughter." The snake-tattooed biker had shrunk into his seat. His companions were looking anywhere but at the gathering of pilots. The bearded man tried to speak, his voice weak. We didn't know. That's the problem," the blonde woman said. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You saw a man in a wheelchair and decided he was less than you. But let me tell you something. That man has more courage in his little finger than you'll have in your entire lifetime. He's faced death and worse. He's made decisions that would break most people, and he did it all for strangers, for people like you." James finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "At ease, Major Henderson. They're just ignorant, not evil." Major Henderson smiled, her eyes shining. "See, even now after everything, he's more gracious than they deserve." She turned back to the bikers. "You gentlemen should think carefully about who you mock, who you dismiss, who you decide isn't worthy of basic human decency, because you never know who you're talking to. You never know what battles they've fought, what sacrifices they've made." Dorothy, the waitress, had tears streaming down her face. Other diners in the restaurant had stood up, some of them applauding quietly. The bikers sat frozen, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. One of them, the youngest, stood up slowly. He walked over to James's table, his head bowed. "Sir, I'm sorry. I have no excuse. What I said was wrong. What we all said was wrong." James looked up at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Apology accepted. "Just do better. Be better." The young biker shook his hand, then walked out of the diner, his face red with shame. The others followed, subdued and silent, their exit nothing like their entrance. Major Henderson knelt down beside James's wheelchair. "We heard you were in the area. Some of the guys wanted to surprise you, buy you lunch. We had no idea we'd be walking into that." James laughed, wiping his eyes. "Your timing was impeccable as always." The pilots surrounded him then, a family reunion of sorts, sharing stories and laughter, turning the diner into an impromptu celebration. They stayed for 2 hours, picking up the tab for everyone in the restaurant, listening to James tell stories about flying, about the mission, about what came after. As they prepared to leave, James looked around at these men and women, these pilots he'd trained, and felt something he hadn't felt in months: purpose. He might not fly anymore, but he'd created something that would outlast any mission. He'd created a legacy of skill, courage, and character that lived on in every pilot he'd trained. Dorothy refused to let him pay. "Your money's no good here," she said firmly. You come back any time and you bring these wonderful people with you." As James wheeled out into the parking lot, surrounded by his fellow pilots, he realized something profound. The wheelchair had made him visible in a new way, had exposed him to cruelty he'd never experienced before. But it had also revealed something beautiful. That dignity isn't about what your body can do, but about who you are. And who he was, who he'd always been, was a man who served something bigger than himself. The bikers' motorcycles were gone, but James hoped they'd taken something with them besides shame, a lesson about humility, about respect, about the invisible battles everyone fights, because the real measure of a person isn't their physical strength or their ability to dominate a room. It's their willingness to stand up for others, to sacrifice for strangers, to choose kindness even when no one's watching. In the end, those bikers had mocked a man in a wheelchair. What they'd actually mocked was a hero, and 35 warriors had walked in to remind them of the difference.